AITA for getting a single mom fired and evicted after she harassed me for weeks because I'm the reason her child's father is a deadbeat? When I first met my ex, it was a typical whirlwind romance. The kind of relationship where everything falls into place so quickly it's almost seamless. We dated for 2 years, and I genuinely believed he was my future. We'd been through a lot together, late nights talking about our dreams, trips that left us laughing until our sides hurt, and small gestures that made life feel like it had a purpose. But like all couples, we hit a rough patch. After an intense argument over something now too trivial to even remember, we broke up, and what I thought was temporary became a harsh reality for a while. The breakup was devastating, but I thought it might be for the best, a chance for both of us to figure ourselves out. For those 5 months, I worked on myself, trying to be okay with the idea that we might never get back together. I threw myself into work, spent time with friends, and buried any lingering feelings I had for him. And when we finally reconnected, he seemed to have come out of that separation with renewed commitment, promising he hadn't been with anyone else. It was comforting, honestly, like maybe, just maybe, our love was something rare and true. But a few months after we got back together, everything shattered. I received a message from a woman claiming to be pregnant with his child, a child conceived during our time apart. My initial reaction was disbelief, then anger, and finally a sinking feeling of betrayal. She sent proof, screenshots of their messages, and photos from nights out. It was undeniable. I confronted him, and at first, he denied it all, then broke down and admitted the truth. He'd slept with her, but he insisted it was a one-time mistake and claimed she had other partners at the time, suggesting the child might not even be his. The betrayal stung even more because I believed he was genuinely invested in making things work with me. That revelation was the final blow. I felt completely deceived. The man I thought I knew, the man I wanted to build a life with, was lying to my face. I couldn't go on like that, pretending things could ever go back to normal. It was like a switch flipped inside me. I knew I had to end things. He was relentless in trying to fix things, but his idea of reconciliation was to bombard me with calls, texts, and even surprise visits at work and home. At one point, his attempts to win me back turned into emotional manipulation, and I had no choice but to get a restraining order. The entire ordeal left me feeling shattered but resolute. I moved, set boundaries, and tried to rebuild my life. I thought it was over, that I'd closed the door on him and everything attached to our past. But, as it turns out, the mess was far from finished. Just as I was beginning to feel some sense of normalcy, a message appeared in my inbox, pulling me right back into the chaos I thought I'd left behind. It was from her, the woman who'd turned my world upside down with a single message months earlier. She had tracked me down yet again, starting with a simple sentence that would set off an entire cascade of drama. Her message read, "You're the reason he's a deadbeat father to our child." It caught me so off guard that I read it twice. My first reaction was a confused mix of anger and disbelief. I had no idea how or why I'd be blamed for her problems with him. I wasn't in his life anymore. I hadn't spoken to him since our split, and I definitely hadn't encouraged him to ignore his responsibilities. Yet here she was, laying the blame squarely at my feet. She included screenshots of DNA results, legal documents, and snippets of conversations where he supposedly confessed that he resented her child because of our breakup. It was surreal, like stepping into a twisted version of reality where I was somehow accountable for every one of his poor choices. She blamed me for ruining her child's life, as if I had anything to do with it. I felt an absurd sense of responsibility mixed with a strong desire to shake her, to tell her she had the wrong person. I ignored it at first, refusing to be dragged into their drama, but she wouldn't let up. Day after day, new messages flooded my inbox. Her words became harsher, more insistent. She told me I was heartless, selfish, the cause of her suffering. The accusations only grew bolder, and I could feel my patience thinning with each one. Then she escalated, making fake accounts to comment on my social media posts, dropping accusations wherever she could. She created burner Twitter accounts to reply to my tweets, calling me a deadbeat by association. Even going as far as to message the people I followed. It didn't matter that I ignored her, she persisted. Every time I thought the storm was dying down, she'd come back, more relentless than before. The final straw was when she managed to track down my supervisor on LinkedIn, leaving a string of unhinged messages claiming I'd enabled a deadbeat father, and that I was somehow morally corrupt. My boss called me into her office to discuss it, looking at me with a mix of concern and amusement, knowing the story already but needing to address it as part of protocol. It was beyond humiliating, being called in to explain this web of absurd accusations. I hadn't done anything to warrant it, and yet here I was, cleaning up the mess. In that moment, something inside me snapped. I had tried ignoring her, tried taking the high road, but she had made it impossible to escape. So, I decided that if she wanted to drag me into this chaos, then I'd meet her on the battlefield. I knew I had to draw a line, a firm one. Something that would make it clear her harassment had to end. Ignoring her only fueled her persistence. I decided to confront her head on, hoping that the direct approach might put an end to this once and for all. I unblocked her and sent a straightforward message, keeping my tone cold and controlled. If you don't stop harassing me, I'll be forced to contact your employer. I wanted her to know I had the power to fight back, that I wasn't her helpless target anymore. Her response came almost immediately. She was apologetic, practically begging me not to contact her workplace. She claimed she needed the job and promised to stop bothering me. For a brief moment, I actually felt a pang of guilt. Maybe she'd realized she'd crossed a line. Maybe this was her wake-up call. Still, I didn't entirely trust her words, but I was willing to give her the chance to keep her promise. I blocked her again and hoped it would be enough to end this bizarre feud. For about a week, things were quiet. I felt relief settle in, cautiously optimistic that she'd finally let it go. But, as if on cue, the harassment returned, only now it was through her family. Her sister, her mother, even cousins I didn't know she had. Each one started sending messages to my friends and family. They claimed I was a vindictive ex out to destroy her life and blamed me for her problems with my ex. It was as though they'd all bought into this twisted narrative that I was the one responsible for every wrong turn in her life. The messages were relentless, popping up at odd hours, from different accounts and profiles. Friends were messaging me, asking what was going on, why these strangers were sending them messages. I was exhausted from explaining the situation over and over, and I could feel the frustration bubbling into anger again. She'd found a loophole in her promise, sending her family to do her dirty work instead of reaching out herself. I felt my patience completely unravel. I realized she would never stop. She'd found a target in me, and as long as I remained silent, she'd keep pushing, escalating this harassment in any way she could. It was the final straw. I felt no guilt now, only determination. I pulled together every message, every screenshot, and began drafting an email. I sent it to her employer, detailing the entire harassment campaign she had launched against me. I made sure they saw just how extreme and unprofessional her actions were, especially for someone working in a field that should have focused on compassion and respect. The response came quickly. They thanked me for bringing it to their attention and assured me that this behavior didn't align with their organization's values. They would be taking appropriate action. A day later, I learned she'd lost her job. She messaged me one last time. Not with rage this time, but with a plea. She begged me, saying she couldn't afford her rent without the job, and that I'd ruined her life. Once I knew she'd been fired, the satisfaction was fleeting. She'd crossed too many lines, and I felt justified at the time. But almost immediately, the consequences came pouring in. The online harassment from her family only intensified, now tinged with desperation and fury. They weren't just calling me names or spamming my inbox, they were dragging my family and friends into it, posting accusations on public forums, and tagging me in nasty messages on every platform they could access. I started receiving messages from people I hadn't heard from in years, wondering why this stranger was blasting my name online. Then I saw the Facebook post from her mother. In it, she tagged me, calling me out directly and blaming me for her daughter's job loss and recent eviction notice. She wrote that I was heartless and vindictive, accusing me of ruining her daughter's life simply because of a mistake made years ago. According to her, her daughter was now without income, without a home, and with no one to help support her young child. The post went viral within my circle, pulling in comments from people on both sides. Some sympathized with her, agreeing that I had gone too far. Others defended me, pointing out that I was only protecting myself after months of harassment. But it didn't end with the online onslaught. Some of her relatives found my family members' profiles and bombarded them with comments and messages, dragging my parents and siblings into this mess. The stress was relentless. Every time I checked my phone, it felt like a fresh wave of shame and anger washed over me. I thought about blocking all of them, of course, but blocking didn't erase the damage. Her mother's post stayed up. Her family's comments were still visible to everyone, and I knew people were whispering about it in my community. I started avoiding certain friends, even skipping social events, worried that someone would bring it up or judge me. It was as if I'd become the villain in her carefully crafted story of woe, painted as the reason her life had unraveled. Late one night, I received a direct message from her, a long, frantic apology mixed with accusations. She blamed me for making her life harder than it had ever been. She said that without that job, she couldn't afford to pay rent, couldn't provide for her son, and that they were on the brink of homelessness. She insisted she hadn't wanted things to go this far and that I'd been unreasonable, blowing things out of proportion. It felt almost surreal to read, considering she'd started this nightmare with her relentless messages, all because of her ex's poor decisions and an imaginary vendetta she'd concocted in her head. In those quiet hours, I wrestled with guilt and resentment. Part of me wondered if I'd acted too impulsively, if reporting her had been overkill, even though every message, every accusation she'd sent me reminded me why I'd taken action in the first place. The fallout was relentless, heavier than I'd anticipated. Everywhere I turned, her family's online campaign painted me as the villain who heartlessly ruined her life. My family and friends had been dragged into the chaos, forced to either block her relatives or endure the nasty messages. It felt like there was no escape, and the guilt mixed with anger gnawed at me. Around this time, my dad called me for a serious talk. He started with a calm question: "Did you really need to go as far as getting her fired?" He wasn't accusing me, but the weight of his disappointment seeped through. He urged me to consider the full impact of my actions on her son and asked if there wasn't another way I could have handled it. Maybe just telling everyone on my side to block them. He reminded me that people would latch onto any reason to judge or condemn without understanding the full story. Hearing my dad say it like that was hard to stomach. I'd always trusted his advice, and knowing he thought I might have overstepped stung deeper than the accusations from her family. He wasn't condoning what she'd done or dismissing my pain. He just wanted me to see how things had escalated to the point where they'd spiraled out of control, affecting innocent people, like her child, in ways I hadn't considered. The guilt I'd been trying to push down began to rise. Had I really handled this the right way? I started replaying every decision, from blocking her the first time to finally reporting her to her boss. It was easy to feel justified when I was angry and hurt. But now, knowing her child's stability was at stake, it was hard not to feel a pang of regret. My friends were divided. Some, like my closest friend, still defended me, saying no one deserved to face that kind of harassment just for choosing to walk away from a toxic relationship. She reminded me that people who harass others online, roping in family and friends, need to face consequences, but others weren't so sure. They urged me to consider what was best for everyone, especially that child, who now had no part in this conflict but would feel the ripples of it. I couldn't shake the image of her child, innocent and oblivious to the mess, possibly facing uncertainty because of the choices we'd all made as adults. For the first time, I started wondering if there was a way to make this right. A way to lessen the impact of my actions while still protecting myself from further harm. Ultimately, it was my dad's words that stuck with me. As I lay awake that night, scrolling through the endless stream of hateful comments, a plan began to form in my mind. It wasn't perfect, but maybe, just maybe, I could find a way to regain control without causing more damage to innocent lives. I needed to take a step back. To find some kind of resolution, even if it meant taking a more difficult road to get there. With the decision made, I knew reaching out to her was my only way forward. The weight of guilt, regret, and sheer exhaustion from weeks of harassment had taken a toll on me. And despite feeling justified at times, I couldn't shake the thought of the child caught in the middle of it all. I sent a carefully worded message to her mother. I'd blocked and unblocked her countless times since this started. But this time I felt I had no other option. I kept it short, saying I wanted to reach a solution where her daughter would stop the harassment on both sides. And in return, I'd be willing to speak to her former employer on her behalf. After sending it, I waited, my stomach in knots. Part of me was sure this would only fuel their anger further. But I clung to the hope that it would help. To my surprise, her mom responded quickly. Her tone wasn't forgiving, but it wasn't hostile either. She said her daughter was desperate, blaming me for her struggles but also realizing that their actions might have taken things too far. She agreed to speak to her family, saying she would keep them from harassing me further if I would fulfill my part. The following day, I drafted an email to her former employer. I didn't retract anything I'd said, but I softened the message, expressing that while her behavior had caused me distress, I recognized that she was a single mother facing challenges. I asked if they might reconsider the decision, perhaps allowing her to work under specific guidelines. It felt strange asking for leniency, but I hoped it would give her stability, something that would also protect me from any future retaliation. When I sent it, I felt a surprising calmness, like I'd done everything I could to defuse this situation. That evening, her mom sent me a message, surprisingly polite and relieved. She confirmed they'd stop harassing me and that her daughter would honor my request to leave me alone. That night, lying in bed, I felt like I'd finally cleared a weight off my chest. I'd taken back control over a situation that had spiraled beyond anything I'd anticipated. It didn't mean everything was perfect, or that the damage was erased, but it felt like a step toward peace, toward something resembling closure. And as I lay there, I realized that maybe, just maybe, I'd made the right choice after all. In the days that followed, life took on a tentative sense of calm. For the first time in what felt like forever, my notifications weren't filled with angry messages or passive-aggressive posts. My family and friends had stopped receiving strange messages from unfamiliar profiles. And I no longer felt the need to constantly glance over my shoulder at work. I kept waiting for another shoe to drop. But instead, I found a strange silence. The weight of the ordeal, however, lingered in the background, even with the harassment at a halt. The entire experience had left me raw, rethinking everything about my last relationship, my judgments, and even the limits of my own patience. I'd never been in a situation where my private life had been twisted into public drama and spread so recklessly across people I cared about, impacting not only my own life but that of my friends, family, and colleagues. One afternoon, my phone buzzed with a message from her. I hadn't blocked her after our truce, hoping things would finally settle without further escalation. Her message was surprisingly simple. I heard from my old job. They won't take me back but said they'd consider a reference. Thanks. Reading it, I felt something resembling relief. It wasn't an apology, but it was acknowledgement. That was more than I thought I'd get from her. And honestly, it was enough. In my own way, I'd hoped she'd land on her feet. Not for her sake, necessarily, but because I knew that without some stability, the spiral of resentment and anger might only worsen, turning her desperation outward again. My workdays resumed with their regular flow, absent of the dread that had accompanied each morning. My friends stopped asking me about the drama I'd been pulled into, and I could enjoy dinner with family without another rundown of the latest harassment from yet another burner account. Life was becoming, in every sense, normal again. In the quiet of it all, I found moments to reflect on how everything had unfolded. There was guilt over the way things had escalated, but I also felt a sense of resilience. I'd stood my ground when pushed beyond my limits and learned where my boundaries lay when it came to protecting my peace. It had taken everything in me not to simply give in or ignore the harassment. But in standing up for myself, I'd managed to regain some control, even if that meant resorting to drastic measures. I wouldn't wish the experience on anyone. But in a strange way, I'd come through stronger. I'd seen a darker side of relationships and what desperation can do to a person. And I'd learned the price of holding on to toxic people too long. There would always be lingering hurt. Some permanent stains on the memories of those years with my ex. But I felt a strange satisfaction in knowing that I'd emerged from the chaos with a better understanding of what I deserved and, just as importantly, what I could never tolerate again. As I closed her message and put my phone aside, I finally felt a sense of peace, realizing that I'd set myself free, and I intended to keep it that way. Returning to my regular routine felt almost foreign. It was like rediscovering life outside the shadow of chaos, finally free from the constant tension that had lingered like a dark cloud. Every aspect of my life had been tainted by the months of conflict. Yet now, there was a sense of renewal in the simple act of living without interference. It wasn't easy, but I felt a newfound appreciation for things I once took for granted. In those first weeks of calm, I started to reclaim my sense of normalcy. It took time to get comfortable with the idea that the harassment wouldn't reappear without warning. I'd catch myself looking over my shoulder at work, or second-guessing each unfamiliar number that called my phone. The paranoia took longer to fade than I expected. But day by day, it slowly loosened its grip. With each passing day, I felt less burdened by the baggage of the past. And as the tension lifted, I found myself stepping back and examining the relationships I had let linger. The people who came into my life by way of connections I didn't truly value. This journey of sorting through people and their loyalties made me realize that some friendships I'd tried to preserve might not be as rooted in genuine care as I had hoped. The support I'd received throughout the ordeal helped me see who truly stood by me. And it gave me the courage to distance myself from anyone who had only added to the noise. My relationship with my family took on a new dimension too. They'd been my anchor, offering steadfast support and listening to the chaos I had struggled through without judgment. Those moments of feeling understood by them, knowing I wasn't alone in dealing with something so bizarre, became a source of strength I hadn't realized I needed. It wasn't just about them offering sympathy or advice but about being a grounding presence I could rely on. It was surprising to me, then, that when I finally looked at the ordeal with distance and perspective, I didn't feel the anger I thought I would. There was lingering frustration, yes, and the scars of being dragged through relentless harassment. But more than anything, there was a sense of gratitude for having made it through. I had been thrown into a storm of someone else's bitterness, yet I hadn't allowed it to derail my life. As I sat back, piecing together the experience in my mind, I saw my life with fresh clarity. In a way, that turmoil had been a catalyst, forcing me to assess my boundaries, test my limits, and define what mattered to me most. In reclaiming my peace, I also reclaimed a sense of direction that had felt obscured before. I had emerged stronger, wiser, and more connected to my values and priorities. I'd done more than survive. I had reset my life on my terms. And with that realization, a calm washed over me, filling the spaces that once held fear. This time, it was different. This time, it felt like I had found a peace that was truly mine. As time went on, I gradually began seeing the impact the entire experience had left on me. On the surface, I had rebuilt my life, picked up where things left off, and regained some sense of normalcy. But the more I processed everything, the more I recognized how much this ordeal had redefined my perception of boundaries and resilience. I understood now that boundaries weren't just about saying no in a moment, they were about crafting an entire framework around one's life. The people in it, and how much energy we allowed others to take from us. In the months that followed, there were days when reminders of the harassment would still crop up, stirring the old feelings. Sometimes a text notification from an unfamiliar number would send my heart racing. Or a random comment on social media would make me wonder if her family was somehow finding ways to insert themselves again. But each time, I leaned on the tools I developed for my peace, simple routines, quality time with friends and family, and moments of solitude that reminded me that I was in control of my space, my life, and my energy. My family became an even stronger support system through this period. My dad, who had once gently advised me to show compassion to avoid worsening her situation, now had a new respect for the boundaries I insisted on maintaining. We discussed the value of cutting people out for the sake of mental health. And it was clear that they understood why I felt this approach was necessary. What's more, my family no longer saw it as a weakness to distance myself from those who would drain or disrespect my space. They saw it as a strength. An act of self-respect I was reclaiming. My friends, too, had shown me who was truly by my side. While a few initially questioned my actions, the ones who stood by me saw the toll it took and never doubted my intentions. They recognized how much I'd tried to handle things quietly, to endure harassment without retaliation until it became impossible. Their presence reminded me that real friends don't just support you in easy times, they're willing to stand by you when the storm hits. I also realized that I had to let go of the guilt I had unknowingly held onto, the guilt for causing someone else's hardship. Even though it had been her own actions that ultimately led to her struggles. It wasn't my job to fix or absorb the consequences of someone else's choices. I found a sense of relief in that realization. I was allowed to protect my peace without feeling responsible for everyone else's outcomes. Ultimately, there was a strange sort of closure that came from this acceptance. I'd weathered a storm I never saw coming, faced a level of harassment and cruelty that might have broken me at another point in my life. But instead, I came out of it with a renewed understanding of myself and a determination to never let anyone blur my boundaries again. I had finally learned to stand firm, knowing that I deserved respect, peace, and control over my own life. Looking back now, I realize that while I didn't get the closure I initially thought I needed, I got something far more valuable: clarity and freedom from toxicity. I had reclaimed my life, carved out boundaries I never knew I was capable of setting, and gained the courage to defend those lines without apology. I had finally learned what it meant to protect myself, emotionally and mentally, and that lesson alone was worth more than I could have anticipated. At first, I thought a part of me would always feel guilty or somehow responsible for the fallout this woman and her family faced. Losing her job and home was devastating, and on some days, I wondered if I'd overreacted or crossed a line. But when I reflected on the months of harassment, the invasive attempts to undermine me at work, and the messages to my friends and family, I knew I had simply done what was necessary to protect my life and my peace. I hadn't chosen this situation, I'd only responded to what I was forced to endure. The most important change has been the shift in how I view and prioritize myself. No longer am I afraid to be seen as cold or heartless for asserting what I need and rejecting what I don't. I'd spent so long trying to keep the peace, to be the bigger person, even to the detriment of my own mental health. Now I understand that real strength isn't in absorbing mistreatment but in having the courage to refuse it. No matter how others may perceive me, I've taken back my power in the simplest but most profound ways. I choose my company more mindfully, hold my boundaries as non-negotiable, and focus on building the life I want without feeling beholden to anyone's opinion of me. Each day, I remind myself that I am allowed to guard my peace, and no one has the right to demand my time, my emotional energy, or my tolerance if they haven't earned it. My relationships with those close to me have deepened, as they now understand my need for boundaries and respect the limits I place. With this new foundation, I feel stronger, more secure in who I am, and more at peace than I ever thought possible. The entire ordeal, painful as it was, ultimately empowered me to step into a version of myself I hadn't known I was capable of becoming. So, as I move forward, I do so with a renewed sense of self. I'm no longer weighed down by doubts or regrets about how I handled the situation. Instead, I carry with me the lessons I learned. I've created a life that's mine, one where I'm the one in control. And for the first time in a long time, I can say with absolute certainty that I am at peace. Months have passed, and life feels calmer, almost serene. When I look back, I'm stunned by the journey, by the tension, the uncertainty, and the resolve it took to navigate it all. There were days when I doubted everything, even my own sense of justice. But those doubts eventually led me here, to a place of self-assurance I never thought possible. It's as though I had to walk through the fire of that relentless harassment and the messy fallout to emerge with a sense of clarity I'd never known. In that time, I've learned that sometimes doing the right thing doesn't feel like a victory. It doesn't bring instant relief or clean endings. There are lingering emotions and a quiet guilt that comes from seeing the consequences someone else faced. Even if those consequences weren't directly of my doing. I think about the woman who harassed me, the single mom who once had a stable job and a place to live. There's a part of me that aches at the way things ended for her. Even as I remind myself that her actions led her there. What's left is not the bitterness of resentment but a quiet resolve to honor my own boundaries and not to apologize for protecting my peace. Through this ordeal, I've rebuilt my relationship with myself. I've come to accept that prioritizing my well-being, my sense of security, and my own happiness isn't selfish, it's necessary. For so long, I'd accepted being cast as the bad guy in situations like this. As though preserving someone else's comfort were more important than my own. But now, I see how misplaced that thinking was. The people who matter most in my life have seen my growth and supported me through it. I've learned to surround myself with those who honor my boundaries and stand by me when I hold my ground. I've taken this strength and channeled it into building a future with firmer boundaries. Valuing my own needs as much as, if not more than, anyone else's. This isn't just self-protection, it's self-love. As I close this chapter, I move forward not with anger or regret, but with a gratitude for the strength I discovered in myself. I faced a version of myself that fought for peace and earned it. I know now that there's nothing wrong with standing firm in the face of mistreatment. Nothing wrong with choosing my own well-being over accommodating toxicity. And so, I step into this new life lighter, freer, and with a sense of peace that's entirely my own.